Hello, everyone, and welcome to Think Smart, Speak Fluent. I'm Jason, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
And I'm Julia. We're so excited to dive into today's topic, which is all about improving your English fluency by thinking in English.
That's right, Julia. You know, many learners focus so much on speaking that they forget about the crucial step that comes before it thinking.
Absolutely. It's like trying to drive a car without starting the engine first. Your thoughts are the engine of your speech.
Oh, I love that analogy. It really captures the essence of what we're talking about. So, shall we start by exploring the connection between thinking and speaking fluently?
Let's do it! You know, Jason, I've noticed that when learners struggle with fluency, it's often because they're trying to translate in their heads before speaking.
Yes, that's a common hurdle. It's like trying to have a conversation while constantly looking up words in a dictionary. It slows you down and breaks the flow.
Exactly. The key is to start thinking in English directly. When you do that, the words come out more naturally and fluently.
It's true. But I can already hear some of our listeners thinking, easier said than done, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a challenge, but it's not impossible. In fact, we've got some practical tips to help our listeners train their brains to think in English.
Great. Why don't we start with one of my favorite techniques? I call it the inner monologue exercise.
Ooh, that sounds intriguing. Tell us more.
Well, it's simple but effective. Throughout your day, try to narrate your actions in English inside your head. For example, when you're making breakfast, think, I'm cracking 2 eggs into the bowl. Now I'm whisking them with a fork.
That's brilliant. It's like being the narrator of your own life story.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is that you can practice anywhere, anytime, without anyone even knowing.
I love that. It's a great way to make English a part of your everyday life. You know, I've got another tip that complements this perfectly.
I'm all ears.
It's called the No Translation Challenge. The idea is to try to understand English directly, without translating it into your native language.
Oh, that's a good one. How exactly does it work?
So, when you're reading or listening to English, challenge yourself to grasp the meaning without mentally translating each word. It might feel strange at first, but it trains your brain to process English more naturally.
I can see how that would be really beneficial. It's like learning to swim by jumping into the deep end, a bit scary at first, but incredibly effective.
Exactly. And just like swimming, the more you practice, the more comfortable and natural it becomes.
These are great tips for training the brain. But I'm curious, Julia, do you have any strategies specifically for improving spoken fluency?
Absolutely. One of my favorite techniques is what I call chunk learning.
Chunk learning? That sounds like we're going to be eating while we study.
Ha! Not quite, though I wouldn't mind a snack break later. Chunk learning is about focusing on phrases and expressions rather than individual words.
Oh, I see. So instead of learning words in isolation, you're learning them in context?
Exactly. For example, instead of just learning the word rain, you might learn phrases like, it's raining cats and dogs, or rain check.
That's clever. It helps you sound more natural because you're learning how native speakers actually use the language.
Precisely. And it makes it easier to speak fluently because you're not constantly searching for individual words, you've got ready-made phrases at your disposal.
I can see how that would be really helpful. You know, this reminds me of another strategy I often recommend, the shadow technique.
The shadow technique? That sounds mysterious.
It's not as mysterious as it sounds, but it is powerful. Basically, you listen to native English speakers and repeat what they say, trying to match their intonation and rhythm.
Oh, like being their shadow. I get it now. That's a fantastic way to improve pronunciation and intonation.
Exactly. And it helps with fluency too, because you're training your mouth to form English sounds quickly and naturally.
These are all such great strategies. You know what I love about them? They're all things our listeners can start doing right away, without any special equipment or resources.
That's a great point, Julia. It's all about making English a part of your daily life and thought processes.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, I think it's time for a fun challenge for our listeners.
Ooh, I love a good challenge. What have you got in mind?
Okay, here's the challenge. For the next 24 hours, every time you look at a clock, I want you to describe the time in English in your head.
That's brilliant. So if it's 345, they might think it's 3:45 or it's 3:45.
Exactly. And if they're feeling really ambitious, they could even add a thought about what they're doing at that time.
Like, it's 2:30 and I'm having a coffee break.
Yes, it's a simple exercise, but it's a great way to practice thinking in English throughout the day.
I love it. And you know what? I think I'm going to take on this challenge myself.
Me too. It's always good for us to practice what we preach, right?
Absolutely. Now, we've covered a lot of ground today. Let's recap some of the key points for our listeners.
Great idea. First, we talked about the importance of thinking in English to improve fluency.
Right. And we introduced the inner monologue exercise as a way to practice thinking in English throughout the day.
Then, we discussed the No Translation Challenge to help understand English directly.
We also covered chunk learning for learning phrases and expressions rather than isolated words.
And don't forget the shadow technique for improving pronunciation and intonation.
All great strategies for improving fluency. You know, Julia, I think one of the most important things for our listeners to remember is that becoming fluent in English is a journey.
Absolutely. It's not about perfection, it's about progress.
Well said. Every little bit of practice counts, even if it's just describing the time to yourself a few times a day.
Exactly. And the more you practice thinking in English, the more natural and fluent your speech will become.
It's like exercising a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
That's a perfect analogy. And just like with physical exercise, consistency is key.
Absolutely. It's better to practice a little bit every day than to have one long study session once a week.
I couldn't agree more. And you know what? I think that's a great note to end on.
You are right. But before we go, let's give our listeners a call to action. What do you think, Julia?
Great idea. Okay, listeners, here's your mission. Should you choose to accept it, take on our 24-hour clock challenge. Every time you look at a clock, describe the time in English in your head.
And if you're feeling brave, share your experience with us. You can leave a comment on our website or send us a message on social media.
We'd love to hear how it goes for you. Did you find it challenging? Did it get easier as the day went on?
And remember, there's no right or wrong here. The important thing is that you're practicing and making progress.
Exactly. Every step forward, no matter how small, is a victory on your journey to fluency.
Well said, Julia. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up today's episode.
It's been a pleasure, as always. Thank you all for listening to Think Smart, Speak Fluent.
We hope you found today's episode helpful and inspiring. Keep practicing, keep thinking in English, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself.
You've got this. Until next time, this is Julia.
And Jason, wishing you happy learning and fluent speaking.
Goodbye, everyone.
Take care.
You know, Jason, I always feel so energized after our episodes. It's like we're on this learning journey, right alongside our listeners.
I feel the same way, Julia. It's incredible to think about all the people out there who are working hard to improve their English.
Absolutely. And speaking of working hard, I've been trying out that inner monologue technique we talked about. It's amazing how much English practice you can squeeze into a day.
Oh, that's great to hear. How's it going for you?
It's really eye-opening. I've been doing it in Spanish. I'm trying to improve my Spanish skills, and it's surprising how it changes your perspective on the language.
That's fantastic. I think it's so valuable for us as language teachers to put ourselves in our students' shoes.
Couldn't agree more. It reminds us of the challenges they face and helps us come up with more effective teaching strategies.
Absolutely. So, tell me more about your experience with the inner monologue technique. Any specific insights?
Well, one thing I've noticed is how it forces you to confront gaps in your vocabulary. Like yesterday, I was trying to describe making my bed in Spanish, and I realized I didn't know the word for pillowcase.
Oh, that's such a good point. It really shows you where you need to focus your learning efforts.
Exactly, and it's those everyday words that can really trip you up when you're trying to speak fluently.
That's so true. I remember when I was learning Japanese, I could discuss complex topics like economics, but I'd get stuck on simple things, like describing how to use a washing machine.
Oh, I can totally relate to that. It's funny how language learning works, isn't it? Sometimes the simplest things can be the most challenging.
Absolutely. And that's why I think techniques like chunk learning are so valuable. They help you learn language in a more natural, contextual way.
Definitely. I've been thinking about how we could incorporate more chunk learning into our podcast. Any ideas?
That's a great question. What if we had a segment in each episode where we introduce a few related chunks or phrases?
I love that idea. We could theme it around a particular situation or topic.
Yes, like chunks for the office or phrases for small talk.
That's brilliant, Jason. It would be so practical for our listeners, and we could encourage them to use these chunks in their inner monologue practice.
Absolutely. It's all about creating those connections in the brain between thoughts and English expressions.
Talking about all this has got me thinking about my own language learning journey. Do you remember when you first started feeling comfortable thinking in English?
Oh, that's a great question. For me, it was a gradual process. I remember having moments where I'd catch myself thinking in English and feeling surprised.
That's fascinating. Was there a particular situation or context where it happened more often?
Now that you mention it, I think it started happening a lot when I was reading English novels. I'd find myself thinking about the characters and plot in English without even realizing it.
That makes so much sense. It's like the story pulled you into an English-speaking world.
Exactly. What about you, Julia? When did you start thinking in English?
For me, it was when I studied abroad in the US. Being immersed in the language 24/7 really forced my brain to adapt.
That's often such a turning point for language learners. Was there a moment when you realized it was happening?
Yes. I remember waking up one morning and realizing I had been dreaming in English. It was such a strange but exciting feeling.
Oh, dreaming in a foreign language is definitely a milestone. It's like your brain is telling you, hey, we're really getting this.
Absolutely. It was such a confidence boost. And I think that's something we should emphasize more to our listeners, celebrating those small victories.
That's a great point, Julia. Learning a language is a long journey, and it's important to acknowledge progress along the way.
Definitely. Maybe we could encourage our listeners to keep a language win journal where they note down these little victories.
I love that idea. It could be anything from understanding a joke in English to catching yourself thinking in English.
Exactly. And it would be a great motivational tool. On tough days, they could look back at all the progress they've made.
That's brilliant, Julia. I think we might have just come up with our next episode topic.
Oh, you're right. Celebrating your language learning victories. What do you think?
I think it's perfect. It's positive, motivational, and something every language learner can relate to.
Wonderful. Should we start brainstorming some ideas for it now?
Absolutely. But first, I think I need to refill my coffee. All this excited planning has left me parched.
Ha! Me too. How about we take a quick break and then dive into planning our next episode?
Sounds perfect. English practice and coffee, what could be better?
My thoughts exactly. Let's reconvene in 5 minutes with fresh coffee and fresh ideas.
Deal. This is going to be a great episode. I can feel it already.
Couldn't agree more. Our listeners are going to love it.
If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Your support helps us keep making great content.